In this video, I'd like to discuss some rebar settings. So under the File menu, if we go to Settings Options, there's four things I'd really like to go through. The first one is clash detection. It's just the check on cover and the check rebar on rebar. And then I also want to go through the three tabs of the rebar sets. Now, the cover and locations we haven't dealt with yet. I'll discuss that in detail. On the general, I've discussed that a little bit, but I'll do a bit more detail on that in this video. But on the rounding and tapering, I've actually done an in-depth video on the, I think it's chapter 6, video 4, where I deal with tapered slabs. I've done an in-depth discussion on how these settings work. So I'll do a brief explanation of these, but please go and see that video, chapter 6, video 4, to get an in-depth explanation of how to work with tapers and slabs. So with that, what I would like to do is start with the clash check. So if we, I think if we isolate, we just need this slab for this explanation. So I'll grab that slab. Let me just make sure that's select all elements. So if I grab that slab, right click, fit work in all views. We've got our slab isolated. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to do the rebar sets and the rebar groups because they work slightly differently. So if I select the rebar set and I just load my defaults, and I think for this exercise, maybe we go to a 16 bar because it just shows up better in the video, 16 millimeter main. I will make it red, that's fine. And the spacing, I'll go 300. I'll hover over the edge of the bar. I'll pick the top, the side, and the bottom. I'll leave that one open. And before I accept the bar, I'll actually pull this back to say 600 mils just to create like a U-bar type of bar, edge reinforcement U-bar. And then I'll say OK. So that will create the U-bar with 600 legs for us. And then while I'm still in the command, I'll just hover in this direction and pick the bottom. And for the color, I'll just make it a different color. Say for instance 3, I'll pick the same size, 16. Distribution 300 is OK. And then before I accept that, I'll just go adjust guideline and I'll pull this edge of the guideline down to the edge of this reinforcement and say OK. So it creates 3 bars for us on that U-bar like edge reinforcement for instance. So it's just a simple example, but these are rebar sets now. Now on the other side, what I will do is I'll go for group, so rebar group, and again just load my default settings. I'll go to the 16 main to keep it the same. Let's keep it the red bar. And then for the cover, 25 is good. And for the start and end, what I'll do is I'll actually force a leg length here for the first and the last. And I'll force a 600 by 600 leg for the start and end leg. And also the spacing is 300 just to suit the other side. I'll pick the reinforcement slab and then I'll just draw a bar shape that looks like a U. I'm not too worried about the legs because it's going to be overwritten. Middle mouse click, and then for the spacing line, I'll just pick this edge of the slab to the opposite edge, and that will now create a U bar, same as the other side. Okay, now for the straight bar that sits on top of it, we can just engage the rebar set again. And in here, we'll have to go 25 as a cover, and this will be 25 as a cover again. And then for the on-plane and from-plane settings, we'll deal with that now. So what I will do here is I'll actually say we want to reinforce this concrete. We want to go from this edge of the concrete to the opposite edge, perpendicular. Middle mouse to accept the shape. And now for our spacing line, once again, we will go from this edge all the way to, that should be 625. Right, so that will give us that. So now if I click on this, now here is already indication of the power of the rebar sets because it does automatic layering for us. We're on rebar groups, we've got to manually do it because it's governed by the cover that you plug in here. So what we're going to do is first of all is we'll adjust the height. So we need to add 19 millimeters to the cover of 25, so that gives us 44. So if I say the on-plane settings is 44, enter. That will pick up the bar so it sits exactly on top of us. And then for the end here, so I'll do a space 0 there to address the end of the bar there. So it puts it right on the end there. And for this side here, I'm going to do 25 cover plus the 19, that's 44, plus the 40 is 74. So if we change this 25 to 74 and I enter, that will then result in exactly the same between the two bars. So we can see there apart from the color. So let's fix that up right now and make that green. Okay, so we have very similar reinforcement there in rebar sets and rebar groups. So a note here is that rebar sets get their concrete cover from the concrete element. So if I click on the concrete element, you can see that the coordinate system is global and it's got blanks here, which means it's relying on default settings. And the default settings for the cover will be under options, setting options. And if we go to rebar sets, covers, it gets its values as a default from here. So if you don't plug something into your property pane, it's going to drag these values across. Okay, and for the rebar group, it's getting the cover from whatever you fill into the rebar pane. So that's the main difference between these two in terms of cover. In terms of clash detection, they work exactly the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the settings. I'll go to options. And I just want to make sure that indeed I've got my um, what do you call it, standard, my standard environment files loaded. Just want to check it and it's okay. And I just want to make sure that I want to regenerate my reinforcement just to make sure that everything complies. Okay, so we've got 25 cover at the moment, but we want to do a clash detection on cover. So how do we do that? So first of all, cover is from the bar, and this is the outside bar. I'm just going to check those two bars. And it's a cover check with the concrete, so we pick the concrete as well. So we've got, if we go here, we've got one slab and we've got two rebars, one being a group and one being a set. So what we can do now is if we now hover over to manage and we go over to clash check and we say check these, it's going to come up with a clash. It's going to come up with two clashes. The first clash that it's highlighting is the rebar group. It's clashing with a slab. And the second one, if I click on that one, is the rebar set clashing with the slab. So if it's not actually touching the slab, how is it clashing? Now we know when we created these bars, we plugged in a 25mm cover. If we now hover over to the settings tab and we go to options and we go to clash check and we just have a look at reinforcement bar cover thickness. At the moment, there's a 35 plugged in there as a default. Now 25 is less than the 35 we're checking against. Therefore, Tekla is highlighting the fact that you do not comply with the cover that you are checking for. And that is why the whole bar is actually in a box and not just a connection. So if we change this value to 25, which now suits our new cover, apply, OK. And also remember, you always have to do a regeneration of the rebar sets. So if we regenerate that, and we now just make sure that all three of those are, let me just reselect them, and also this one, yeah. If we now take those three again and we just say check them, now all of a sudden we've got the green flag. It says everything is okay because now we're complying with the cover. And I'll cancel out of that. So if you do a clash detection and you get your whole bars covered in a square, it's normally an indication that you are checking against cover and your cover that you've applied on the bar does not match the cover you are checking as your clash detection. The second thing I want to check is rebar to rebar. So if we click on this bar and we click on this bar, and we also click on this one and this one, so all four of those bars, and I didn't hold in my key when I selected them. So let's just pick them again. So we've got four reinforcing bars here, four objects. If we now do a manage and we do a clash detection between them, we run the clash check, we can see again we've got two clashes. We've got this bar clashing with that bar, and if we go to the next line, we've got this bar clashing with this bar. Now, if we go to the settings once again, options, and we look at the clash check and we look at this line, it says there it wants to check for 0 0 between them. Now, these bars are lying on top of each other. In other words, there's absolutely no gap, no space between them. So they physically, they're not overlapping, but they're touching each other. Now, according to this, that's a clash. So if we change this, it says here negative value to allow for an overlap. So if we just say, look, it's not critical because reinforcement has, they've got deformed ribs on them, they deformed bars. They could physically overlap by at least X amount of millimeters, which you can decide. But if I plug in a -1 there and I say apply, okay, and I go back to rebar and I just regenerate my rebar sets, yes. And then I make sure that I pick all my bars again, like so. And I just rerun this clash check. You'll see now we have solved all our problems in terms of the clash check. You can now see that on this side, there's no clashes, and on this side, there's no clashes. It shows a little a thing there, but I think it's just a leftover from the previous run. So if we just close that off, so we just pick this one and this one. Sorry, let me speak the bar properly. This bar and this bar, and we do a clash check just on that one. Say run. You can now see there's no clashes. It doesn't list anything, so there's no clashes. So that is how you resolve the clashes rebar on rebar, is to allow for a little bit of overlap. Rebar is not an exact science. There are ribs that are going to be overlapping a little bit. So if you plug in a sensible value there, you'll see that you won't get any clashes there. So moving on to the next setting. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select all the rebar because I don't need those anymore. I'll delete them. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to put in a new rebar into the slab because I want to look at the description of the rebar, the layer description. So if I go to face and I'll load my standards again, my default standards, I'll make this a 300 spacing just to get the bars a bit far away. And then what I'll do is I'll go for near side and I'll go both directions. Actually, let's go single direction. So if I hover over the slab, let's pick that direction, and then I'll go far side, pick the same direction. And then what I'll do is I'll go over and change the color. You could put them in as 2 layers in one go, but the way I'm doing is I can change the color. So what I'll do now is I'll just pick the other end. So if I go over here and then pick the near side, pick over there. So that takes care of top and bottom in different colors. And now what I want to do is I want to change the color once again to a 4, which is the dark blue color. And for the creation method, I'm going to pick a number, and the number of bars I want to pick is 1. I only want 1 bar on the side. I'm going to place a side bar now. And then I know this is a 200 slab. So if I want a bar in the middle, I need to give it a start offset of 100. So now if I hover over this and make sure you're on the far side, you can now see the direction is different. So we'll go just swap the direction over. So if I put a bar in there, you can now see the single bar that comes up on the side, single bar. And if I hover this around, pick this edge, single bar. Oh, I picked the wrong side. Let me just fix that up quickly. And then on this side as well, let's just pick this one. Okay, so now I can just go and grab that bar and delete it. Okay, so now all those have been created. So what we need to look at now, and what I'll do for this is I'll actually open our options tab and I'll go to rebar sets and I'll keep that open there, and I'll move the slab over to here. So let's start at the bottom, and also I'll go over to the custom inquiry. Make sure that you select the rebar inquiry form. And if we select the bar at the bottom, the red one, and we click that, you can see it's getting a layer B1. So where does it get this B1 from? Bottom one. It's whatever you set up in. Now remember, these concrete were created with the global coordinate system, so it's going to refer to these values in these box. If you had the local coordinate system, which I'll explain in a minute, it will refer to these tabs over here. So it's picked up the bottom as a bottom. The 1 comes from the layer, and the layer comes from the prefix. This layer attribute constitutes out of a prefix and a layer number, and I might just show you by go Control E, and once you get your advanced options and you type in your layer and you say in all categories, this here, and maybe I'll just drag it over so we can see the value. You see, this is the setting. This is the setting for that layer. And what we say here is give us a layer prefix and a layer number, and it concatenates the two together to give you that format string. So that's where the B1 comes from. So if we select the green one at the bottom, it's getting the bottom layer again, but this time a layer 2. If we do the top, it's a top 2. If we do the opposite direction, top 1. And then these, it refers to the side because we said the sides should be labeled with an S. And because there's only a single layer there, it's always going to be S1 right around until we put a next layer in there. Now, that is all because if we click on the concrete and I go to the concrete, the property pane, it's because in our coordinate system, we've got global. And the values for the cover, it's dragging from here. If you don't overwrite them in the property pane, it's dragging it from here. So that's how that works. So let's just move over to the, I think what I'll do is I'll do the beam next. So if we go a crossing bar, and we can just load our standards, and then I like to use a 5 for a ligature. So if we click on a ligature and we select all the sides and we say OK, it's going to grab a ligature there. If we now go and say give us a longitudinal bar, we can then say instead of target, give us a number, and number bars, the number of bars we want is 2. And then we can hover over the section and pick the bottom and the top and say OK. And then for the sides, I'll change the color to a blue. And for the distribution, I'm going to say give us a number, and the number we want to create is 4 bars, but we are going to omit the first and the last bar. So now if I select over the section, I pick that side and this side, and I say OK, we're getting our 2 bars because the top and the bottom has been omitted. So that pretty much deals with the beam. So let's have a look at what's happened here. So if we look at the bottom reinforcement again, and we go to our custom inquiry, our rebar, we can see that we've got B2 listed, which is correct. It's a second layer bottom. If we click the top one, it's T2, which is also correct. And again, it's getting it because we've got a global plane orientation. If we look at the ligatures, it's coming up with LK. Now, LK, you can see links, is on a chapter of its own because this is common to local and global coordinates. So it doesn't matter which system you're working in terms of your concrete, which we'll explain in a minute. Links are going to be defined as LKs or whatever you plug in there. If you want to change this, if you want to say, for instance, if you want to say, I want this to be LNK for whatever reason, you say apply OK, and we go modify regenerate. If we then select the link, you'll see it will change to whatever value. But in this case, we don't really want that. So what I'm going to do is I'll just options. I'll just change it back quickly to LK, apply OK. Well, I won't even apply. I'll just regenerate from here so we can keep that open. So if I now select that, it's back to LK. So the blue bars are obviously side one because it's now the second layer. The ligature is the first layer, but it's a sidebar, and that will be the other side because of the global system. Now let's have a look at walls. So if we look at walls, and I'll go crossing bars in this case. Actually, no, let's go by face. And if I go again and load the standard reinforcement, and this time I'm just going to be a quick cut. I want to pick both sides, and I'll go near face, and I'll pick this edge for the main. And then what I'll do is I'll go far face, and I'll pick this edge again for the main. And then what I will do is, like before, I'm going to say give us a number of bars, give us 1 bar, and this is a 400 wall, so let's start 200 off the edge, and let's change the color to blue, and we will go for a single bar near side. And then what I'll do is I'll hover over here and just put that single bar in there, and I'll flip over just for the sake of it being easier. I'll put a bar in there, and then I'll put a bar, and now I've lost my command. So let's just put a bar in here as well, like so. Okay, now that we've got the wall done, the issue here is we would be expecting this to be near face layer 1, near face layer 2. But if we click on it, we go to custom inquiry at rebar, it's coming up with side again. And if we click on that, it's coming up with side 2 again. And if we click on this one, it's coming up with side. So what's the issue here? Well, the issue is that if we look at the coordinate system for a wall, you really want to be a part local coordinate system. You want to be dealing with top, bottom, front, back, start, and end values. You want these values in the wall. So to achieve that, you click on the wall and you change your plane to local and you say modify. And as soon as you do that, you can then go more, regenerate the rebar. You say, okay, so it's regenerated that. So now let's look what we've got. If I click on this, we now have under our custom inquiry, we've now got near face 2. If we click on this one, we've got near face 1. And if we click on the opposite side, we've got far face 2 and we have far face 1. If we look at this bar, it's defined as a start 1, which is this one, yeah, start 1. And if we look at the opposite side, it's defined as end 1. This one here is defined as bottom 1, and the top is defined as top 1. So where does it get the start and end business from? So the quick answer to that is that if we go over to the applications and components menu and you just type in your show, well, let me do that. So if you type in show, there's a little macro that sits here. It says show coordinate system. This is show a parts coordinate, local coordinate system for a part. So if I double click on that and I hover over the concrete of the wall, you'll see Tekla will draw a little localized axis here. If I double click again and I click on the beam, we get the localized axis for the beam. And let's just leave the slab for a minute because I want to change the slab and show you how it's actually changed that. Now, in terms of forming a part, if we click on this part, you can, and I put off the direct modification, you can see we've got a start and an end grip here. And that is the direction of the positive axis, the way you've put it in. So that is why that red line is going in that direction, start to end. So that's positive X. And in the terms of a wall, your Y is it points to the bottom and the top, and your Z points to your faces, to your near and far side. On the slab, it will be top and bottom. But so if you look at your X-axis, your positive X-axis, this is your start side. And that's why if we go to our custom inquiry, we get a start here. And the end of the axis is your end. And your Y, the top of your Y will be your top one, and the bottom of your Y will be the bottom one. And then obviously your Z, which is the blue axis, will then host your near and far face settings. Now, in terms of a beam, it's the same. If you click on the beam, there's your start point of your beam. There's your end point of the beam. That's why this red axis is pointing that way. And then obviously, if I had to take this beam, remember that these blue lines, if we look at it, it's start and end. But if I had to take this beam, go over to properties just quickly and change this to the local coordinate system, and I say modify, and then let's just regenerate the reinforcement. Yes. If we now look at the blue, we're not getting, we go to custom inquiry, we're not getting a side anymore, we're getting a near face because it's now applying local coordinate rules. It's now creating, it's applying this part local coordinate system. The values you've plugged in now is now applied to this beam. You wouldn't do this. A beam should be on the global coordinate system, in terms of its layer prefixing, but it's just to sort of explain where all this is coming from. So that's your far face. This remains the bottom, that remains the top because of your y-axis orientation. And this, because it's a ligature, it's a closed loop, it will be a link because this is common to both those areas. Now, in terms of a slab, a slab works differently. A slab is, if you look at where the yellow is, like this, I know when I drew the slab, I started here, but I can't remember where I clicked that as a second or that as a second. Did I go clockwise or anti-clockwise? So what we can do is go back to our little macro and click on the slab, and that sort of sorts that out for us. So we know we've started here because of the yellow icon, and we've actually gone this way. So you can see the positive red axis is this way. So that will be node 2, 3, 4. Okay. So with that in mind, if we had to take this slab and then go to the coordinate system and also change this to local and say modify, and then go to more, regenerate values. Let's have a look at what's happening now. Now remember, this was top one, top two, bottom one, bottom two, and side one all the way around before. So if we go to the custom inquiry on rebar and we click on this, it's now got near face. Because why? It's now looking at the z-axis for orientation, and it's looking at the part local coordinate system. So that now becomes your near face, the bottom becomes your far face, and this now becomes bottom one. Why? Because it's the bottom of the y-axis. The y-axis is that green you see in that direction. So that side should be your top now. And this should be the start, which it is because there's your orientation and it's along the x-axis, and this should be your end. So it's just a bit of an explanation on how these work. I hope that's clear. I know it's a lot to take in and to get your head around, but it's actually very simple once you sort of understand how that works. And you could use those coordinate axes to actually not only specify different covers, but to also drive your layering prefixes so it makes it easier on your drawings. So let's move on to the next setting, which is the distance. So for that, what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to go Control P. I'll double click on my reinforcement and just wipe out all of those because we don't need them anymore. And then also what I want to do is I want to make sure that these parts, and I'll just engage them again, these parts are all back to the global system, so that well, that can stay local because that's all. I'm not going to use that, so I'll make this global as well. Modify. Okay, so that is back to the global system. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a change here just to illustrate the point. So I'm going to, prior to Tekla 2022 for the Australasia environment, these were set to coefficient of bar diameter and 10 times. So it's 10 times the bar diameter. So I'll apply that. If we now go to a crossing bar and we just load our standards, which is just a normal 12mm bar, and I think the rest is right. I'll maybe just increase the spacing to 300 just to split the bars a bit. If I now hover over the edge of this bar, or this slab rather, and I accept all the edges and I say OK, look what's happened. Tekla's drawn a start leg, intermediate leg, another intermediate leg, but no end leg. And why did that happen? Well, it's very simple. In our settings that we're using, we said for the maximum bar length, that's the total bar length. The minimum length we can have is 10 times bar diameter. And that is easily exceeded here because this is quite a long bar, so no problem there. If we look at the second line, it says minimum straight start end leg length. So the start leg, which is the top leg, is more than 10 times bar coefficient. That's why it's drawn it. But if you come around and you end up with this vertical, it's not enough bar there. There's not enough length there to satisfy this condition. Now, we can change it in two ways. We can either change the value here and regenerate the bar, but that will have a global effect. It will change all the bars to comply with this rule. Or otherwise, what we can do is we can click on the bar and change the value in the settings. Now, I'll just show you that both of them work. So in this case, we want to address this. So we want to make it a distance, and I want to make it a distance of 0, which says any length goes. Create a bar leg irrespective of length. And I say modify, and just like that, we now have our bar length. Tekla is now happy with that. So whenever you create a bar and you're missing a leg, go and look at your rules regarding general in here. Ideally, and we have changed it for our environment, Australasia environment, from 2022 upwards, it is now distance for both of them, and it's 0 for both of them, and that's the correct way of doing it. So I'll apply OK. So now with that applied as OK, if I now go and say give us a crossing bar, and I'll hover over this side and I say OK, it creates all the legs for us in one go. No problem with that anymore. So that pretty much takes care of that. Now, lastly, what I want to address is just tapering. Now, I did say before that tapering is dealt with in detail in chapter 6, video 4, but maybe what we'll do is just quickly point out a few things. So if I click on this slab and I pick only the bottom and I say, okay, if we now look at this from the top, we can see that there's already a bit of a taper applied to these bars. Now, if you have a slab that's very slightly sloped out like this one, you might not want this because this is really excessive cover over here, and maybe the engineer will have a problem with that. He says, no, I really need some reinforcement in here. The way to overcome that is if you look at the bar, if you click on the bar and you look at the tapered, if you go under tapering, you'll see nothing has been filled in. There's no settings there. So obviously, if there's nothing in the property pane, it's getting its values from the default settings, which is under options. And if we go to rebar sets, under rounding and step tapering, it's this. So for straight bars, it's 50. Start and end leg, it's 50, and intermediate, it's 50. So Tekla is dragging those values. So these are all straight bars, so it's applying a 50 millimeter taper. So the workaround for that then is to click on that bar and to go tapering, do not apply any tapering and say OK. And just like that, we now have tapering following the edge of the slab. If, however, this is a very long slab and you do want to split these bars, if we go to click on that, and also maybe just here before I actually do that, I'll make a quick setting here so we can see the effect of it. If I go back to rebar sets, general tapering, I'll just change this to 1. Apply, OK. And then also just regenerate the bars. Yes. So if I click on this bar, and I go to splitter, and maybe just move this out of the way a little bit before we split, and then go to splitter, make sure we load our standards, and then just hover over any distance there, and we split the bars. Now, there's two things that come to play here. The first thing is if we look at the bars, it's at the moment you can see if we click on the bar, it's 952, 1147, and these are constant at 150. So in the bending schedule, if we look at the inquiry, we're going to have 11 bars which are straight bars, and then we're going to have single bars all varying. So we want to get rid of that for one instance. Second instance is we want to round these bars to 5 mil. So there's two settings we need to deal with. Now, the first setting is with the splitter. Those bars got split to an accuracy of 1 millimeter because the splitter tolerance was set to 1 millimeter. So if we go back to the settings menu, options, and we go rebar sets, rounding and tapering, and we say rounding up at splitters, and we change this to 5 millimeters, and we say apply, OK, and we then go and regenerate our reinforcement. Yes, override. And we now click on that bar. You can now see it's rounded up to the closest 5 mils on both sides, which just in terms of a straight bar just looks much better than rounding to 1 millimeters. So the extra, it's rounded up, extra is taken up in the lap length. The other thing too is that sort of given addresses the next entry, which is splitter tolerance. So we're getting nice dimensions now. And the next thing we want to do is reduce the amount of reinforcement. So if we go to inquiry, we can see we're still dealing with all these. We need to reduce that. So now we can click on the rebar set, go back to the taper that was set to none and say, no, actually, do give us a taper on this one. And it's straight bars we're dealing with. So give us a taper of 50 millimeter and say modify. Now you can see because there is a splitter present in the set, Tekla adheres to the slope distance and it maintains cover. And the actual taper tolerance or step tolerance is taken up in the lap itself. Again, there's several settings that you can play with here. Refer to that video I did. At the moment, it's set to 50 millimeters, which means this one will have the minimum. If I click on the splitter and I look at this value, 450, this one will comply with 450. And 450 plus 50, these must be within that range. Otherwise, it creates a new group. So maybe just put on the group coloring so we can see it better as well. Yeah. So again, if I take an F measurement and I measure from there to there, you can see that that's got to comply with a 450 at least. And this is got to be within the 450 plus 50, in other words, not exceeding 500. And if I click on this one, I'm not exceeding 500, but the next one will definitely exceed the 500 if I look at the Y value here. That's why a next group is formed. What I could also do is I can click on the rebar range and say instead of having a distance of 50, I can plug in a number of bars and I say I really do want to group 4 bars together, for instance. If I then say OK, then if we do a redraw, we can now see we've got 4 bars, the green bars, 4 bars together. Again, the shortest lap complies with the whatever, if you click on the splitter line, whatever you plugged in here, whether it's reading it from the rebar database file, or whether you've plugged in a custom value, whatever you plug in here is going to be the compliance for the minimum lap length, and the others are going to be within the tolerance of your step distance or your step number. So if we go back to our settings and we just quickly have a look at what's left here. So we've pretty much dealt with the clash check, with the checking your rebar cover and checking your bar on bar. And under the rebar set, we've looked at the local and global settings and your layer prefixes and how to manage those. We've also looked at the creation or non-creation of bar legs and why some bar legs don't get created. And then finally, with the rounding and the step tapering, we looked at the step distances. We've also looked at the splitter. Now, these are just purely tolerances, pretty much the same as what the splitter works, but just on the rebar itself. And yeah, we've got as a default, the straight leg is formed in increments of 5 millimeter. Down, rounding down at the moment, and the last and intermediate legs are the same. And the reason why these are rounding down and not up is because if you have a ligature and you're rounding up, you will encroach in cover. It's the same with the straight bar. If you're rounding up, you are going to potentially encroach in cover, and you don't want that. You rather want a little bit more cover than a little bit too less cover. So hopefully these are just the normal options for the rebar settings. In the next video, I'm hoping to deal with some advanced settings for rebar in the Control E, or if we go File, Settings, Advanced Options, we'll be looking at what's going on in this dialog box. Thank you for watching.